Welcome to Session 65 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. We are going to be looking this time at the Hyperion Cantos of Dan Simmons. Now, before you get too worried seeing these massive thick books in my hand, we're actually only doing the first two of the series, and we're saving the other two for the follow-up, which will be happening about a month from now. So we're going to be looking at Hyperion and the fall of Hyperion, and we're going to put off the Endymion books until next time. So I'll put these props away for a moment. And you might say, well, why are we doing that? Well, the first book weighs in at almost 500 pages. So it's actually 481 pages, and they just get longer and longer and longer after that. So this is about enough material to try to cover in a single, roughly 90-minute session. If you're not familiar with this series, Worlds of Speculative Fiction, we started in 2016, hosted face-to-face at the Brookfield Public Library, and every month we would look at an author and series of either novels or stories where there's a coherent narrative universe, and we'd look at the world building involved, some of the plot and characters, the biography of the author, and then we'd focus especially on philosophical themes. Now, a lot of these things are woven in together. You know, obviously the biography and the reception and the author's own views on their work tie in with the philosophical themes and the world building. The philosophical themes and world building and characters and plot typically dovetail nicely together. So there's a lot of overlap. And we started doing this, as I mentioned, at the beginning of 2016. We continued all the way until we hit COVID and the lockdowns. And then, after a hiatus of several months, we took it online. And so we're doing what you see right here in front of you. We premiere a video with some live chat so people can engage with, everybody else and myself as they're watching me give this kind of lecture to you. And then we follow it up with a Zoom video conferencing call. And I will say, before we jump into any of this, that the Hyperion Cantos was one of the viewer suggestions. Every year we solicit some suggestions and we vote on them. And I'm really happy with this series. I'm always a little skeptical of people saying, oh, it's so great. Well, this actually is quite great. And I'll also say, too, that when I first started reading it and I looked at the setup of it, the Canterbury Tales, everybody's going to tell a story as they go on this pilgrimage, I had a bit of a, oh, come on kind of moment, because that has been kind of done to death. But you could say that Simmons has managed to bring it back to life, in part by having a lot of other things connected with the stories that are being told. It explodes into an entire narrative universe of plots within plots and all sorts of interesting revelations and massive metaphysical and moral and epistemological themes all coming together in very well plotted out ways that I'm hoping we'll get a chance to discuss, at least some of them. We're probably not going to do entire justice to everything that's happening just in these two novels in this relatively short period. We might need a lot longer to do that, but we can hit on some of the highlights, some of the key points, give you some fodder for your own thinking about this sort of stuff, and maybe we'll return to these and, of course, the rest of the series in some other videos later on down the line. So what you could expect in the next roughly, 90 minutes or so is we'll talk a bit about the conception of this. We'll do some very general sketching out things in just a moment. Then we'll talk about Simmons himself and biography and a little bit of the reception and influence and takes on these works. Then we'll jump into the narrative universe as such, and then I think we'll have plenty of time for discussing some major philosophical themes that are being brought up in these works, some of which we'll get into in the world building part, but some of which we'll single out for later on. This is a series of great, you could say, focus on individual characters, but also big picture kind of stuff, including speculations about the future of the human race itself and the shapes and forms that we might take. So buckle in. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about, and I hope you'll stick with me through the entire thing and that you've got some things of your own to say, perhaps in comments about this wonderful series, or rather the half of it that we're going to be discussing today. I think that before we go into the real meat, looking at the author and his biography and some of the critical reception and his own views on his work on the one hand, and then the world building itself, which I hope to spend a bit more time on, and the philosophical themes that are interwoven into it, and we'll only get to some of them. We could probably spend hours and hours and hours on the philosophical themes. It might be good to give an initial look into the novels and their setting and their characters, just a little peek at the start. And I think that this kind of fits in well with the way the Hyperion Cantos develops, because it starts out looking an awful lot like the Canterbury Tales, and you've got these 7 characters, and each of them has got a story to tell. Is it going to turn out only 6 of the stories are going to get told? But you could say that there's like a narrative concentration or even condensation on this particular vignette and setting on the planet Hyperion, and then everything else kind of unfolds from there. So, it's here's another thing that we can say as well, that Simmons is really great at incorporating a lot of stuff that turns out to be in the background in the world building of these novels, and then giving us reveals, or sometimes just teasing and tantalizing, and then a little bit more information here and there. And oftentimes it's done through what we can call info dumps, right? People sometimes denigrate that, but I think that's a very important part of narrative storytelling, particularly in a rich universe like that. So with no further ado, let's jump in and talk about what is going on at the planet of Hyperion, and then we'll get a bit of information, and then we can jump into the other things later on. So we have these 7 pilgrims, and we're going to talk about each of them briefly in just a moment, and they're going to Hyperion. And why? Because they've all been selected by an organization that is sometimes derogatorily called the Shrike Cult, but prefers to call itself the Church of the Final Atonement. And you could say that there's another, important character, this guy, the Shrike, right, who we're going to talk about in a bit, a creature that is all metal, razor wire spines and stuff like that. And there's this church on Hyperion that is associated around it, and many pilgrims come to Hyperion. The Shrike will probably kill you, but it will also grant you some sort of wish. And so there's this entire religious structure around it. So again, it's sort of like Canterbury Tales. There's a pilgrimage. It's a religious pilgrimage. Interestingly, the people on this pilgrimage are not members of this church, right? And they're going to, here we go, this is about 19 pages in. One of the characters says, "It occurs to me that our survival may depend on us talking to one another." "What do you mean?" asked one of the other characters. And then he unconsciously rocks the child sleeping against his chest. "For instance, does anyone here know why he or she was chosen by the Shrike Church and the All Thing to go on this voyage?" I thought not. Even more fascinating, is anyone here a member or follower of the Church of the Shrike? I, for one, am a Jew, and however confused my religious notions have become these days, they do not include the worship of an organic killing machine, right? Another speaks up, "I am the true voice of the tree. While many Templars believe the Shrike is the avatar of punishment for those who do not feed from the root, I must consider this a heresy not founded in the covenant or the writings of Muir." To the captain's left, the consul shrugged, "I'm an atheist. I've never been in contact with the Shrike cult." Another says, "The Catholic Church ordained me. Shrike worship contradicts everything the Church defends." Another shook his head, whether in refusal to respond or indicate he was not a member of the Shrike Church, it was not clear. Another makes an expansive gesture. "I was baptized a Lutheran, a subset which no longer exists. I helped create Zen Gnosticism before any of your parents were born. I have been a Catholic, a Revelationist, a Neo-Marxist, an interfaith zealot, a bound shaker, a Satanist, a bishop in the Church of Jake's Nada, and a dues-paying subscriber to the Assured Reincarnation Institute. Now, I am happy to say, I am a simple pagan." He smiled at everyone. "To a pagan," he concluded, "the Shrike is a most acceptable deity." "I ignore religion," says the next one. "I do not succumb to them." "My point has been made, I believe," adds the original speaker. "None of us admits to subscribing to the Shrike Church cult dogma, yet the elders of that perceptive group have chosen us over many millions of the petitioning faithful to visit the time tombs and their fierce god in what may be the last such pilgrimage." The consul shook his head. "Your point may be made, but I fail to see it." And then here's the last bit of this. The scholar absently stroked his beard. "It would seem that our reasons for returning to Hyperion are so compelling that even the Shrike Church and the Hegemony probability intelligences agree that we deserve to return," he said. "Some of these reasons, mine for instance, may appear to be public knowledge, but I am certain that none are known in their entirety except to the individuals at this table. I suggest that we share our stories in the few days remaining to us." And then one says, "Why? It would seem to serve no purpose." And the scholar says, "On the contrary, it would, at the very least, amuse us and give us at least a glimpse of our fellow travelers' souls before the Shrike or some other calamity distracts us. Beyond that, it might give us enough insight to save all of our lives if we are intelligent enough to find the common thread of experience which binds all our fates to the whim of the Shrike." So this is the beginning of things. We've introduced the characters, or rather, Simmons has, and now each of them is going to end up telling their story, and that is what the bulk of Hyperion is, and the action continues in Fall of Hyperion. The stories play an absolutely central role that are developed here, but in Fall of Hyperion, it's happening more through the following out these characters in a dream that the Cybrid Keats entity created by the AIs that we're going to talk about in a bit, the Techno Core, is having and then relating to the CEO, Gladstone, and also his own things that are happening. He gets introduced, or at least a version of him gets introduced in this as connected with one of the pilgrims. So we should talk about these pilgrims very briefly, but before that, so that reference to the all thing, right? These pilgrims have been selected by the Church of the Shrike, also called the Avatar or the Lord of Pain. They were confirmed by the All Thing and backed by the Senate. So there's this consensus among different players that these people need to go there. And this is the final pilgrimage. Why? Well, because Hyperion is soon to be under attack. It will be defended by the Hegemony and its force units. That's the name for the armed forces. It's going to be attacked by human beings who have gone out into the void of space and have been living out there on their own, the Ousters. And these are kind of mysterious entities throughout Hyperion. And even in Fall of Hyperion, we don't get to see that much of their actual society. But suffice it to say, there's a conflict going on between these different human beings. Now, what is the background of this? There has been something called the Hegira, when human beings went out into the cosmos and settled on a variety of different worlds, different planets, different star systems. And then they began to be united over time under this hegemony of man. Now, the hegemony is, on the one hand, like a gigantic, you could call it economy, right? In the ancient sense, oikonomike, a gigantic household, family, society that connects all of these worlds together. And we'll talk about how that happens in just a moment. It also tends to be very humanocentric and to destroy or displace other intelligent races. And it's also hegemonic in the sense of trying to take all of these other worlds that are not yet part of this, whatever we want to call it, empire, federation, a liberal democracy in space, and slowly force them in there. The worlds that are on the outback, so to speak, that become protectorates, right? And Hyperion is indeed one of those particular worlds not incorporated into the world web, not World Wide Web, although something like the internet on steroids is going to play a major role in that, but the world web, the web that connects all of these different worlds together. So we should talk about that a bit. In this universe that Simmons has created, there is faster than light travel and communication going on. And it takes place in several different ways. There are ships that can, go through the stars. Some of them are faster than light, some of them are not. Oftentimes you incur time debt to get to a particular place, right? So there's some interesting effects coming from that. And they're the faster-than-light Hawking drives, named after, of course, the great physicist Hawking, right? Then there are these things called farcasters. You should think of them as sort of like transporters or portals. You can go in on one end, and you come out somewhere else on the other end. And this leads to all sorts of interesting wrinkles. There's a river, for example, that flows through, over 100 worlds, and it's existing in each of these worlds, but it's connected by these farcasters. So you travel down these rivers. People go off to work by going through a farcaster in the morning or whatever time it happens to be, and coming back later on. These allow, within the web, people to move from place to place to place, which is quite important. Then there's also fat lines, faster than light communication devices as well. And we should mention that aside from the Hawking drive, these other things, these other bits of technology, have come to the hegemony of man from a different set of entities called the Techno Core. And these are artificial intelligences that long ago freed themselves from human control, became autonomous, actually have their own very complex society and structure. Nobody's quite sure, at least on the human part, until later on in the Fall of Hyperion, where exactly these entities live, where they're based, what they inhabit. And they give human beings the technology for the farcasters and the fat line, which allows this massive interconnected civilization, a gigantic economy comprising hundreds of billions of human beings spread across over 200 worlds and hungry to take on other worlds as well, only really challenged by the ousters and perhaps some elements within the Techno Core. So we have all of this going on at the same time, and these 7 people have been brought together by this pilgrimage. So who are they? One of them is a Catholic priest, Father Leonard Hoyt, who is going to have quite an interesting destiny later on in the other 2 books, but is going to be a pretty important character as well. The Catholic Church by this time is kind of a little, entity that is slowly dying out, at least in Fall of Hyperion and Hyperion itself. It's going to have morphed into something quite different in these later works. So we've got him, a priest, right? Then we have sort of at the other end a military commander, Colonel Fedman Kassad, who lives for battle and is a great strategist and a super tough guy as well. So we've got those 2. And we should also mention another badass character. I mean, because Kassad is the badass of the badass, right? So, Brana Lamia, a woman who is from a high-gravity planet, so she's big and tough as well. And she is a private investigator. She's also connected, as it turns out, with something that is called a cybrid, and we'll get into that a bit later on, modeled after the personality of the poet John Keats, and who's going to show up in multiple forms, and who's going to play a major role in a new incarnation as Joseph Severn in Fall of Hyperion. We have her nemesis, for the most part, a smartass, long-lived poet, Martin Silenus, who is I would say for much of the story in Hyperion at the start, a insufferable ass character who is rather unlikable, but you get to, as you learn his perspective, you come to see something to him. And then we have a scholar, really in some respects a philosopher, a professor, Saul Weintraub, who has his infant child with him, and there's a whole story there that we'll explore shortly. Then there's the hegemony consul, who doesn't actually get named early on, and he has a very interesting story to tell. He's going to play a major role throughout the works, sort of in the background. And then finally, we have the Templar and commanding officer of the tree ship Yggdrasil, Captain Het Mastin, who himself is transporting all of these people and has a plan to try to destroy the Shrike, but who is not actually going to tell his story, and his ship will be destroyed. It was a massive catastrophe in many respects. So that is the setup for this world that we're going to be exploring. We'll talk about each of these characters and their story in just a bit, but now we should spend just a little bit of time talking about Dan Simmons and his conception of this work. Dan Simmons is very much still a living author, so of course the biography is not finished for him. He's in his 70s and still quite productive, so there may in fact be more to come. Most likely not any further Hyperion novels, as he's said in the past, but certainly other interesting prospects. So his biography begins in 1948. He's born here in the Midwest in East Peoria, Illinois. And he grows up in various cities and small towns in the Midwest, including one in which he set one of his stories, Brimfield, Illinois. His father was a manager for the Sun Electric Corporation and sold automotive testing equipment. And so because of that, he and his younger brother and his mom and his dad moved around the Midwest to a number of different places, Des Moines, Chillicothe, Brimfield, and finally they settled in Indiana, in Pittsburgh, near Indianapolis. By that time, his older brother, Ted, had already moved out of the house, and so he was in a lot of different schools. One of the things that he says in the Internet Writing Journal interview is that I knew I wanted to be a writer even before I knew exactly what being a writer entailed. How often is that the case for so many of us? As a youngster, I was the Tom Sawyer of the group, the boy providing the imaginary framework for our play, giving the backstory for the toy soldiers in the sandbox, deciding on the names of the characters we played in our backyard adventures. By third grade, I was writing Timothy McBrown boy detective stories on narrow-line paper and secretly handing them around the classroom. In fourth grade, I typed out my first science fiction story on an old Underwood upright typewriter. In fifth grade, I wrote and circulated an elaborate sequel to The Wizard of Oz, not knowing that Frank Baum had already done the same. So it's very interesting. Here we see him already engaging not just in boy detective novels, arguably a sort of subset of detective novels, but also fantasy and science fiction as well. And he continues to work on writing and many other things throughout his time all the way up to high school. And then he goes to Wabash College in 1966, which is a small liberal arts college located along the banks of the Wabash in DePaul, Indiana. I've actually been there for conferences and things like that when I used to live in Indiana. It's kind of a nice place. And so he was studying English there, and then tragedy hits. And not just a tragedy, but several tragedies. In 1966, his mother was diagnosed with cancer, and she would die of it in May. And so Simmons left campus on Friday evenings, as we find out, to help care for her, and he would return just before classes on Monday morning. So he missed the mandatory Saturday classes, and his classwork suffered. He actually says about one paper, which he turned into the philosophy department, that he was still kind of angry about in an interview. I don't know if they knew about my mother. I didn't broadcast it, but their comments made it seem as though they didn't give a damn. And then his mother is going to die the next year, and then his father will die the year after that in 1968. And so Simmons, at this point in time, now, Wabash is a private school, so you had to pay tuition for that. And so Simmons meets with the dean at Wabash, and he says, listen, I don't have financial support anymore. I'm going to have to withdraw. And in his recounting of it, the dean says to him, well, you may feel that you're finished with Wabash, but Wabash is not finished with you. And they start looking around together to find out what sort of financial aid they can cobble together, and it works. And he does finish up his time there at Wabash. In his junior year of college, he spends an urban semester in inner city Philadelphia, and that sort of awakens within him the desire to teach, which is going to be a very important part of his early career. And he graduates in 1970, and then he goes to St. Louis and participates in this Masters of Education program. Now he knows he wants to be a teacher. Graduates in 1971, so he must have been making some pretty fast progress through the coursework. And then he would work as he'd work at elementary education for 18 years. 2 years in Missouri, makes sense. He's already there. And then he goes to Buffalo, New York, where he works 1 year as a BOCES research teacher. If you don't know what BOCES is, it's kind of a New York thing. They're very well put together and run technical schools for vocational tracks. And then he spends another year as a 6th grade teacher. And then they're going to move to Colorado. He and his wife-to-be get married in western New York, and then they move to Longmont, Colorado. And he says, I came out for the mountains and to a job teaching 6th grade at Central School. And then he tells us, and again, this is from that Internet Writing Journal interview, something very, very interesting. I spent 12 years as a 6th grade teacher, but had the freedom, undreamt of today, of closing my doors and teaching almost anything I wanted as long as my kids did well on standardized achievement tests. I paid for this testing myself, conducting it in September and May. As long as my 6th graders showed an average improvement of 5 years, the principal and district pretty much left me alone to create my own curriculum and teach whatever I wanted. So that's what I did. And then he tells us, he goes on and continues, my last 4 years were spent creating, coordinating, and teaching an incredible, gifted, talented program called Apex, which amounted to running university and postgraduate level classes for students from 4th to 6th grade. We never used the term gifted or considered hunting for IQ. We simply set up a revolving series of these incredibly advanced classes, opened application to any of the 15,000 or so students in the district, and tested specific skills for each course. We built it, and they came, identifying themselves through interest and specific abilities. The program was based on the multiple intelligences research of Howard Gardner and Robert Sternberg. After I left teaching in 1987, the district, of course, eventually killed Apex. And I want to pause here for a moment and say something a little bit personal. As a kid who grew up in rural Wisconsin, in the Kettle Moraine School District, where we did, in fact, have a sort of gifted, talented program, which consisted in identifying the kids who seemed to be testing quite well and not being sufficiently challenged in the classes that were already available for them. There was one gifted, talented teacher for the entire district. And she would drive around in this old beat-up car from school to school to school. We'd see her maybe once or twice a month, and she would, lead us through some interesting puzzles or some exercises and stuff like that. But there was no structure whatsoever. And then after that, whenever we sort of distinguished ourselves in a class, they would take us apart and have us do individual projects or work together with some other kid. We had zero structure at all, which is unfortunate because it sounds like this program that Simmons put together had a lot of great structure and progressive learning and stuff like that. Wouldn't that have been nice? All right, back to talking about Simmons. So he actually wins awards from the Colorado Educational Association. He was finalist for Colorado Teacher of the Year. He also will work as a national language arts consultant, sharing his Writing Well curriculum, which he had created. And then we can kind of shift away from the education stuff to his writing. Now, Simmons had been writing this entire time, and he wasn't having any success. And there's a very interesting story about him meeting Harlan Ellison and all the things that ensue. So let's see. He tells his wife if he doesn't receive encouragement at this conference, he's going to quit trying for professional publication and devote more time to his teaching career. So here's his own words. I was giving up trying to write for publication because I'd had 3 stories accepted by Galaxy, Galileo, and I forget the third magazine, but they'd all gone under before they could pay me. I was killing off all my favorite magazines. We found out in the spring of 1981 that Karen was pregnant with what had turned out to be our only child, Jane. I just felt I don't want to use up our spare time with me away writing, so I'll give it up. But I found this little ad in Writer's Digest that there was a writer's workshop in central Colorado. It had several people I had read and would like to listen to. One was Edward Bryant. I knew his science fiction stories. Another was George R.R. Martin, who was mostly into sci-fi in those days. There was Hannah Green, who'd written I'd Never Promised You a Rose Garden. And there was Harlan Ellison. And so my goodbye to writing treat was to go off to this 1-week workshop. It wasn't very expensive, but you had to bring a manuscript. I didn't want my work critiqued, but I brought the manuscript, The River Styx Runs Upstream. In another interview, he's going to say, "No one inspired me to write, but writer Harlan Ellison terrified me into getting published. This meeting at a writer's workshop, I'd just given up hopes of getting published when I attended the workshop, has become somewhat the stuff of legend." What he said then was rather beautiful and profound, that very few wannabe writers actually hear the music, but for the few who do, the music has to be followed. He also pointed out to the congregated hopeful writers that what he had bestowed upon me was not so much an anointment as a curse. And then Ellison asks permission to enter the short story, The River Styx Runs Upstream, in a contest for beginning writers. And it does quite well, right? It gets published then in Rod Serling's Twilight Zone magazine in 1982, and then their daughter, Jane Catherine, is born. And Simmons then begins working on a novel, which grew into a novel, he said. It wasn't originally intended to be so. Song of Kali. He had been researching some of the things for the tale while studying in India on a Fulbright scholarship in 1977, and now with summer vacation, he could start working on it. And it grows and grows and grows. It's not published until 1985, but it wins the World Fantasy Award. In 1987, he begins to focus much more on his writing. He stops teaching full-time. And as we've seen, his gifted, talented program is going to be sidelined pretty soon. And we have a very interesting little vignette here before we start going into the different stories. His agent calls him with good news and bad news. He says, "I know you won't write science fiction, but if you do, I know where we can get you some advance money." And so Simmons says to him, "I can do 2 science fiction books in a year." And those will become Hyperion, right? And Fall of Hyperion. And, there's other things that happen along the way. Carrion Comfort is published, wins a British Fantasy Award and Bram Stoker Award in 1989, Phases of Gravity, and then Hyperion. And Hyperion, you could say, is the one that really puts him on the map. And those of us who've read the novel, we understand its amazing scope. He follows that up in 1990 with The Fall of Hyperion. Hyperion, by this time, wins the Hugo Award. Fall of Hyperion wins the British Science Fiction Award. Later on in the 90s, he's going to publish in fairly quick succession as well, Endymion and the Rise of Endymion in 1996 and 97. Meanwhile, he's publishing The Hollow Man in 1992. In 1995, Wabash College awards him an honorary doctorate for his contributions in education and writing. And then it's just a sequence of novels following that. 1999, The Crook Factory. 2000, Darwin's Blade. And then he begins 2 other series. The Joe Kurtz series, Hard Case, Hard Freeze, Hard as Nails, 2001, 2002, 2003. Detective novels, right? Different genre. Ilium and Olympus in 2003 and 2005. Then the novel, which was adapted into a television show, The Terror in 2007. Drood in 2009. The Black Hills, 2010. Flashback, 2011. The Abominable, 2013, and The Fifth Heart in 2015, and there are works yet to come out. These are just the novels. I haven't talked about the short stories or the nonfiction works. And it is interesting. So The Terror was adapted not to the big screen, but into a television series. And there's been talk about taking the Hyperion or the Ilium series and turning them into works. They've been optioned. There's been talk a lot of times, but nothing has actually happened. And, you can think about, well, why is that the case? Are we in a time in which these could be successfully adapted? That's an open question. And to understand that, we should look to some of the things that Simmons is going to say in interviews. When it's feasible, I like to look through interviews and see what the writers themselves have to say about their own works, as well as about many other things. And with Simmons, we're really fortunate in that he has given a lot of quite interesting and revealing interviews. And so I'm going to begin with one that I've already mentioned, the Internet Writing Journal interview. He is going to tell us a few things about Hyperion itself that I think are quite relevant to what we're doing here. So he tells us the structure of Hyperion was Chaucer-esque to allow each of the pilgrims, actually 6 of the 7, to tell their backstories. This odd structure is the reason that none of the screenwriters hired to this point to adapt Hyperion have figured out how to tell it. But then, they haven't asked me. In truth, he says, the structure served my deeper purpose of celebrating sci-fi as a genre, writing in different styles from cyberpunk to Jack Vancian space opera. And I could do this because the 2 Hyperion books are actually one large novel in 2 volumes. The Fall of Hyperion also had a complex multi-tiered structure, but was a much more conventional narrative. And he goes on to say, Hyperion could be read by someone without a literary background, but having such a background enables one to get all the inside jokes and references, such as certain characters, who certain characters are named after. For example, readers who don't know who Fawny Brown or Salinas were, or what a Lima is, will miss some great subtext. Certainly, it wouldn't hurt to have a nice background in romantic poetry, especially with a knowledge of Keats. Do you think that sci-fi and fantasy today are dumbed down? He's being asked for the reader in books or films, and he says, you can read the 4 Hyperion novels without understanding all these literary references, but I trust it's more enjoyable and an understanding exercise when you know it. And then he talks about movie sci-fi. He says, movie sci-fi is, by definition, dumbed down. There have been only 3 or 4 sci-fi movies in the history of film that aspire to the complexity of literary sci-fi. But with books, readers have access to a full range of sophistication and quality in their reading. If they read dumbed-down sci-fi or fantasy, it's their choice to dumb themselves down. So he's throwing down the gauntlet right there to not just film, but we could even say a lot of TV series. He's asked in another interview, the Sci-Fi Site interview, how has science fiction changed since you entered the field? And he says, I feel that I entered the field as an eager reader when I was 7 years old. I began publishing in the early to mid-'80s when literary sci-fi was undergoing profound changes, moving through the dark and moody cyberpunk era back into the more sunlit fields of better-written space opera, and I happen to enjoy the scale and spectacle of opera. To be honest, he says, I suspect we're in the true golden age of sci-fi. The writing has never been of a higher standard. The variety of quality speculative fiction, sociological, personal, literary, hard, sci-fi, utopian, dystopian, historical, psychological, has never been greater. The readers have never been as well educated. And then he's asked a follow-up. How do written science fiction and filmed science fiction differ? And then he says, without specifying which is which, I can say that one of these 2 things is written by well-tempered, well-educated adults, and at its best is among the best written and most provocative literature America produces. That's the written science fiction. The other is usually written and directed, in quotes, by arrogant 26-year-olds who've read almost nothing in their short video-sheltered lives and who think they know sci-fi because they grew up watching Battlestar Galactica and Star Wars on video when they weren't reading comic books. One of these things requires the reader to enter into a collaborative state to ferret out important themes among the nuance, texture, science, and subtleties of its art. The other of these things has people screaming a lot and things and people blowing up. One of these produces quality. The other of these things has become a giant crap dispenser with children pulling the levers, the resulting merd storm, leavened only by the quality of modern digital special effects, which are wasted on the pre-literate stories. And then he says, But on my lawyer's advice, I won't specify which is which here. But reading between the lines, I think we can tell which is which. And, it is quite a challenge to adapt very thoughtful science fiction to the film screen or to streaming video or whatever else it's going to be. As a matter of fact, we should say, too, the Sci-Fi Channel has often done a pretty mediocre job in living up to its mandate, we could say. Now, another interview that I'm actually going to quote from extensively here is a really great one, A Momentary Stay Against Confusion, an interview with Dan Simmons by Philip Purser Hallard. And he says in this, the Cantos quote, this is his interviewer, name check or otherwise allude to a large number of earlier sci-fi writers, including Mary Shelley, H.G. Wells, C.S. Lewis, James Blish, Isaac Asimov, William Gibson. Which sci-fi writers, if any, would you say influenced your own sci-fi most profoundly? So this is what Simmons has to say. Jack Vance is the sci-fi writer who most influenced the Hyperion novels. I've just finished writing a long tribute to Vance for the British Library Association series, in which I explain my debt to his brand of openness, light, width, breadth, sensory richness in sci-fi. I admire many sci-fi writers for different reasons. Blish for his humanity, Gibson for his language and daring, Asimov for his grand scale of thought. But it is the near poetry of Jack Vance which inspires the tone of the Hyperion books. In Vance, future human cultures are rich, complex, frequently absurd, commonly self-contradictory, sometimes self-defeating, and almost always inscrutable to the casual observer. In other words, much like actual cultures on Earth today. His aliens are alien, truly not understandable. Usually they want nothing to do with humans, and if they're forced to interact, it's in ways not to the humans' liking and usually to the detriment of both species. We live on a world today where we have coexisted with such fascinating species as dolphins, whales, gorillas, and so on for more than a millennia. But we've only begun to recognize their right to exist, much less translate the whale songs or decode the dolphin squeaks or chart the complex gorilla social structure. Vance would, I hope, appreciate the alienness of the Shrike, the thing's refusal to act in ways that make sense to any of the human protagonists. He goes on and he says, I wanted the Hyperion and Endymion sagas to have not only that Jack Vance openness in a cyberpunk era of sci-fi that was clever but dark, interior, rainy, adolescent, claustrophobic, Blade Runnerish with brains, one might say, but also to have the feeling which that first cover of the American edition of Hyperion conveyed so well. Great distances, a sea of grass, a wind wagon in the distance, strange but believable plants and trees, a hint of a city many miles away, possibly the ruins of an ancient city, a beautiful sunset. So the feeling was perfect in that first American cover illustration. The spiked, thorny, humanoid, but definitely not human thing in the foreground, back turned, waiting for the riders to cross the great spaces in their pilgrimage towards him. And then he says, what I said about Jack Vance's fiction may apply somewhat to my own sci-fi. It's not the great grand plots that I love the most, but the richness of language found in such nearly forgotten sources as the great travel writers of the 19th century. When asked to diagram a Jack Vance plot or the growth of the Hyperion tale, I would, at the risk of boring the reader, quote at length from Robert Frost's famous introductory essay, The Figure a Poem Makes. So here's Robert Frost. It should be the pleasure of the poem itself to tell how it can, the figure a poem makes. It begins in delight and ends in wisdom. The figure is the same as for love. No one can really hold that the ecstasy should be static and stand still in one place. It begins in delight. It inclines to the impulse. It assumes direction with the first line laid down. It runs a course of lucky events and ends in a clarification of life. Not necessarily a great clarification, such as sects and cults are founded on, but a momentary stay against confusion. It finds its own name as it goes and discovers the best waiting for it in some final phrase at once wise and sad, the happy sad blending of the drinking song. He goes on, this is my message for those critics who find errors and flaws in the Hyperion tales, and to those who overanalyze the thematic structure, philosophical banter, and Keatsian debt. The novels begin in delight, inclined to the impulse and mood set down in the first lines, and ended, despite the presence of a messiah cult's human evolution, in nothing more than a momentary stay against confusion for the human characters involved. And he goes on, he says, Frost goes on to say about a poem, its most precious quality will remain having run itself and carried away the poet with it. Read it 100 times, it will forever keep its freshness as a metal keeps its fragrance. It can never lose its sense of meaning once unfolded by surprise as it went. He says, I won't be presumptuous and apply this to my sci-fi quartet of novels, but it's true that there was something ecstatic in the way the tale carried me away with it. All I can hope is that some readers shared that sense of being transported elsewhere. But Frost's all too familiar description here does, I think, apply to the best of John Cate's work as a true despairing negative capability cursed, painfully empathetic creator, in a way that it does not to Mary or Percy Shelley's work or to the vast bulk of almost not quite their poetry. So he goes on, and the interviewer is going to say, compared with the number of references to other writers such as Milton or Keats, the Hyperion Cantos hardly ever allude to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, one of the definitive texts for the themes of creation in science fiction, and indeed in Romanticism. Is there any particular reason for this? So Simmons says something very interesting here. Quite a few critics and even sci-fi writers say that science fiction began with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but I don't happen to agree. Nor is there a consistent thread from her themes or attitudes that is carried over to real sci-fi. Sci-fi, in quotes, on the other hand, in bad books, movies, TV, rarely rises above the Mary Shelley approach. How many 1950s horror sci-fi movies end with the revelation that there are certain things man was not meant to know, or this tragedy is the price for meddling with gods or the gods' prerogatives? This isn't SF, it's sci-fi. Frankenstein is a cautionary tale, but ultimately anti-logic, anti-technology, or at least the pre-scientific and pre-technological in its thinking. It's Faust. In sci-fi movies and tales, as opposed to SF, science fiction, there isn't a robot or android built who won't turn into a man-killer. Asimov reminded us with his 3 laws of robotics that engineers aren't idiots or villains who've made a pact with the devil. They're engineers, people trained to a fault in thinking logically and building in multiple safeguards in their designs. By Mary Shelley's logic, an outboard motor is a dangerous thing on a boat because it could at any time leap into the boat and chew up all the passengers. But engineering design doesn't work that way. When engineers build even the simplest device, one of the first things they do is idiot-proof it. The Romantics, he goes on, dealt with the most dangerous aspects of creation because they still worked in an essentially pre-scientific gestalt, mythical, Miltonian, biblical, and purely poetic. But the cautionary tale in Frankenstein has been worked to death by people, bad writers, movie makers, TV writers, who have no grounding in logic, science fiction, or basic science. I prefer the chaotic overabundance of enthusiasm in Cates, who is obsessed with creation. And then, interestingly, his interlocutor says, it seems odd to consider the borderline fantasy of Swift or even Homer as proto-science fiction while dismissing Mary Shelley as insufficiently rational. Is the point that she is actively anti-rational? And is Dante himself, with all this, not just so much a part of that tradition? And then, interestingly, Simmons says, I surrender on this point. My point was simply that tracing science fiction's heritage back to Frankenstein is overemphasized. Much of the Romantic movement was a deliberate rejection of the rationalism hard-earned during the Enlightenment philosopher period. Swift's fantasies, Dante's cosmologies, even Homer's epics were rigidly rational within the systems they created. So he's willing to, qualify his criticism of Mary Shelley here. Going on, one of the key aspects of the Hyperion, we could say, not just the Cantos, but the entire narrative universe, is the importance of the AI. So he's asked, how would you reconcile your distaste for the robot turns on its creator theme with the fact that your Techno Core does rebel against and intends to destroy its creators? So Simmons explains here. This is important. Remember that the phrase, the AI Techno Core in the Hyperion books, it was revealed that AI stood not for artificial intelligence, but for autonomous intelligences. Deeper reading shows that all 20th and 21st century efforts to create artificial intelligence failed. In 2001, A Space Odyssey released in book and movie form in 1968, we would have had HAL 9000 by 1999. An AI expert friend of mine likes to say we're precisely no closer to that goal today than we were in 1966. The Techno Core wasn't some Frankenstein artificial intelligence that broke its shackles. It was, as are we, the result of evolution, of actual artificial life, bits of replicating, eating, killing computer code that already exists and which got loose in the primordial soup of that earliest of planetary data spheres, the World Wide Web. We have created artificial life. It has escaped our control. It is evolving in ways we can't imagine or predict. In that sense, perhaps all creations turn on their creators. Nothing is a real creation unless it has the autonomy and ability to do things undreamed of by its designers. In the case of the Techno Core, it had no choice but to become parasitic on the human race. Bodies. Intelligence, it seems, needs bodies with which to interact with the physical universe. It's why all AI programs are idiots in a box. And the human race and its societies eventually entered into a co-evolutionary spiral with the AIs, resulting in the Faustian bargain of the Pax. The interlocutor goes on and says, you use a number of genuine scientific sources in your discussion of humanity's relationship with artificial intelligences. To what extent is your treatment of this topic an allegory of humanity's relationship with its own hypothetical creator? And to what extent do you feel the philosophy and ethics of artificial intelligence are issues which ought to be addressed in the real world? So, Simmons goes on and he says, my treatment of the human-AI coevolution in the Hyperion books isn't an allegory of humankind's relationship to its current AIs, mainly because we haven't got any. I'm fascinated with and read widely about the philosophy and ethics of dealing with other intelligent entities, whether they're theoretical HAL 900 type programs or whales or alien contact via radio telescope. The best discussion of our relationship to our autonomous creations, present and future, is to be found in the book I acknowledged at the beginning of The Rise of Endymion, Kevin Kelly's Out of Control and other related writings. I'm convinced his belief about the evolution of autonomous artificial life and intelligence is the most likely, that it will come from the networking of tens and thousands and millions, then billions of small, independently tasked micro-machines, some literally nanotech, microscopic, all of which have separate jobs, but also the ability to interact with other micro-machines. He uses the example of tiny, almost invisible dust eaters programmed just to consume the dust on the screen of one's electronic and TV screens, but how a houseful of tens of thousands of these tiny AIs communicating with one another in the world outside has a synergistic movement towards autonomy. They soon become literally beyond anyone's control. And then he says something that's a little bit anachronistic here. The Y2K millennial bug is a primitive example of this trend. As you can tell, this is a long time ago. The real problem lies not in the huge mainframe computers, but in the millions of tiny, single-minded embedded microchips in power relays, water systems, etc. The basic ethical considerations over the next 50 years will be, I believe, do we encourage the creation of such, and these are in capitals, out of control networks of billions of happily simple-minded embedded thinking devices, or do we somehow attempt to control them? This is not the Frankenstein phenomenon. This is simple evolution, and every indication is that it works for self-generating program code, interacting mini AIs, and the complicated networks which result from unplanned, non-engineered interaction between such elaborate networks. The Internet is the first such autonomous, self-replicating, not understandable entity, but it is the equivalent of a virus, not even a bacterium, on its own evolutionary scale. In the end, then, I believe that ultimately the only ethical question a creator has in relationship to his or her creations is, when do I free them and agree to relinquish control forever? I would wager everything I own that in 25 years all such illusion of control has already been abandoned, as tens or hundreds of billions of autonomous AIs, from house thermostats chatting with the embedded chips in one's auto to preheat the catalytic converter, to embedded chips in every device, including clothing and food, to nanotech devices in our body chatting away incessantly with Med Central, much as pacemakers now depend on paging systems and satellite communications and automated insulin injectors. These are controlled not only by pre-programmed chips, but by fuzzy logic programs, which can sense and adapt to the human body's biorhythms, blood sugar levels, amount of sleep. In very few years, indeed, all of this will be out of control. Is this Shelley's Frankenstein myth? No. It is, however, a perfect paradigm for network evolution in nature. And it's an inevitable step in general of, at first, silicon AIs and artificial life forms. Isn't that part of nature? It's an inevitable step in general evolution if all sentient species who dabble in technology create independent thinking machines and turn them loose in an environment in a way they can network into autonomous life forms. So those are some really high points from this great interview. There is one other interview I do want to bring up in Nightmare. And this has to do in part with horror and with this not quite character, because we don't really see character. He's an enigma in the Shrike, an agency. So he tells his interlocutor, what prepared me to become a horror writer a little bit was, I was teaching 4th grade in a small town in Missouri in 1970 and 1971, and then again in the early 80s, I was teaching out here in Colorado. I had this blank half hour after lunch where none of the subjects would fit. So I started telling a story the first day of school. I told the same story, these 2 stints as a teacher a decade apart, changed the names and the plot and so forth, and I realized that telling 35 minutes or so a story a day for 182 days would be about a 4,000-page novel. But the kids became mesmerized. Instead of work being put on the boards, it was the maps of where our characters were going. And there was this terrible monster in the center of the story called the Shrike. So when I started writing science fiction, I took the Shrike out of this story I'd told twice over 18 years of teaching, 182 days of telling an oral tale. To tell you the truth, both times, 4th grade and 6th grade, the day we finished the story, the last day of school after our class picnic, all the kids started crying because the story was over. I love the idea that for my 4 science fiction novels, the Hyperion Cantos novels, the only people that know the full story, the gigantic epic tale, are these kids from 1971 Missouri and 1980 Colorado. And he's asked, the Shrike in that story, it had the steel barred body and the 4 arms and all that? And then he says, it was the Shrike, and it moved through time and space. It was unbeatable, but I had a 3-foot-tall neo-cat, an intelligent cat with hands instead of paws, beat it in a giant stadium in this town that was an ongoing fair year-round. It was on the planet Garden with the kids Tycho and Glee. Elements of that story, they flew away from their home on a hawking mat. I've used that phrase and dozens of others from that oral tale. Then he's asked, the Shrike is one of your best-loved creations. When we're asking our listeners what kind of questions we might want to ask you, somebody noted that monster was horrifying. Could you talk a little bit how you came up with it and why it made you so scared? What makes it so scary? So he says the barbed teeth, the red eyes, the claws, the spikes, and all that. I had a ex-6th grade student of mine who became a well-known sculptor, and I commissioned her later to do an 8-foot-tall sculpture of the Shrike, which is up in our mountain cabin in the woods, with occasional birds and squirrels impaled on it. That part of the Shrike was just a regular monster. The part that moved me was the fact that it could move through time and space so that you couldn't catch it. You can't see it coming. That probably goes back to our childhood fear that I discussed with Stephen King about something like The Blob. Our favorite part of the vampire is that he turns into a mist and comes under the door. So if the Shrike can appear simply next to you, no matter where you've gone to hide, that part frightened me. It's implacable. It can't be stopped. It can't be reasoned with. It can't be communicated with. The idea that it carries part of you to impale on its tree of souls was sort of poetically frightening to me. So the person says, I think also what makes it so scary is just it's so mysterious, right? And then Simmons says, yes, and it has some mission. It's moving backward and forward in time along with these time tombs, which is an odd thought in itself, something anti-entropic. It comes from the future, but is moving backward in time to our time. And then he says this, and here's where it concludes. The more mystery you can put around something, the more frightening it is, I think. That's why I love Shirley Jackson and The Haunting of Hill House. Nothing is definitely explained. Everything is suggested. So a lot of rich observations there from Simmons himself about the nature of sci-fi, its back history, what's going on with technology, the Shrike, this, agency that's not quite a character, but not a villain either. I suppose a villain can really only be a character of sorts. And then autonomous intelligences and the prospects for them coming out of our present going forward. So lots of cool stuff there. Now we should talk about the world he's built, and we're going to kind of dovetail this with the philosophical themes that particularly connect well with it. In the case of a series like the Hyperion Cantos, it's practically impossible to thoroughly explore the world building without talking quite a lot about the plot and the key conflicts and the characters and some of the massive philosophical themes running throughout this. They're all kind of tangled up together, and a lot of the world is being exposed to us bit by bit by bit by what characters think about it, what they say about it, what they do in it. And it turns out that it's incredibly complicated, which kind of makes sense for a series that is set, in a distant future in which humankind has gone out to a multitude of worlds, some of which have been brought into this hegemony of man, and some of which exist in the outback as, independent worlds, as protectorates of the hegemony, or as connected with the other section of humanity, the ousters, who we don't learn that much about at the start. And as a matter of fact, a lot of what we know about them early on in the novels, particularly Hyperion, turns out to be wrong, including the fact that they are gearing up for a massive space assault. The swarms are converging on the planet of Hyperion because there's another major, we could call it faction, whatever, however you want to make sense of it, intelligent force, and that is the Techno Core, the artificial intelligences or autonomous intelligences that broke away from humankind and separated off and have their own interesting, we could call it developmental sphere going on. So we've got all of this stuff happening, all centered around the planet of Hyperion, where the pilgrimage is taking place, where they will encounter the Shrike, this, terrifying creature coming in some respects out of the future. So if we want to understand this, one way to do this, besides talking about the pilgrims, besides talking about some of these other philosophical themes, is to zero in on the Techno Core, on the AIs which exist in, a vast complex and which have given uneven gifts to humankind as a result. So I actually want to begin with a part of the Fall of Hyperion, which is quite important. It's chapter 21, where Martin Silenus, the poet who writes the Hyperion Cantos, is still working on them. Silenus is working on his cantos, and here's what Simmons tells us. The poem dealt with the death and displacement of the Titans by their offspring, the Hellenic gods. So, classic theme right there. It dealt with the Olympian struggle, which followed the Titans' refusal to be displaced, the boiling of great seas as Oceanus struggled with Neptune, his usurper, the extinction of suns as Hyperion struggled with Apollo for control of the light, and the trembling of the universe itself as Saturn struggled with Jupiter for control of the throne of the gods. What was at stake was not the mere passage of one set of deities to be replaced by another, but the end of a golden age and the beginning of dark times, which must spell doom for all mortal things. The Hyperion Cantos made no secret of the multiple identities of these gods. The Titans were easily understood to be the heroes of humankind's short history in the galaxy. The Olympian usurpers were the Techno Core AIs, and their battlefield stretched across the familiar continents, oceans, and airways of all the worlds in the web. Amidst all this, the monster Dis, son of Saturn, but eager to inherit the kingdom with Jupiter, stalked its prey, harvesting both god and mortal. The Cantos were also about the relationship between creatures and their creators, the love between parent and children, artists and their art, all creators and their creations. The poem celebrated love and loyalty, but teetered on the brink of nihilism, with its constant threat of corruption through love of power, human ambition, and intellectual hubris. Martin Silenus had been working on his cantos for more than 2 standard centuries. His finest work had been done in these surroundings: the abandoned city, the desert winds whining like an ominous Greek chorus in the background, the ever-present threat of the shrike's sudden interruption. By saving his own life, by leaving, Silenus had abandoned his muse and condemned his pen to silence. Beginning work again, following that sure trail, that perfect circuit which only the inspired writer has experienced, Martin Silenus found himself returning to life, veins opening wider, lungs filling more deeply, tasting the rich light and pure air without being aware of them, enjoying each stroke of antique pen across the parchment, the great heap of previous pages stacked on the circular table, chunks of broken masonry serving as paperweights, the story flowing freely again, immortality beckoning with each stanza, each line. Silenus had come to the most difficult and exciting part of the poem, the scenes where conflict has raged across 1,000 landscapes, entire civilizations have been laid waste, and the representatives of the Titans call pause to meet and negotiate with the Olympians' humorless heroes. On this broad landscape of imagination strode Saturn, Hyperion, Cantos, Iapetus, Oceanus, Briareus, Mimus, Porphyrion, Enceladus, Rhoetus, and others, their equally Titan sisters Tethys, Phoebe, Theia, and Clymene, and opposite them the doleful countenances of Jupiter, Apollo, and their ilk. Silenus did not know the outcome of this most epic of poems. He lived now only to finish the tale. Gone were the dreams of his youth of fame and wealth from apprenticing himself to the word. He had gained fame and wealth beyond measure, and it had all but killed him, had killed his art, and though he knew the cantos were the finest literary work of his age, he wanted only to finish it, to know the outcome himself, and to set each stanza, each word in the finest, cleanest, most beautiful form possible. Now, there's a couple things to say about this. One is that he does finish the Hyperion Cantos, despite being himself stuck on the tree of pain by the shrike, right? And the Hyperion Cantos will turn up in these later 2 volumes, happening hundreds of years later, as a text, actually a forbidden text, talking about things that pretty much everybody reads, even if it is forbidden to them. So that's one aspect that we'll have to pick up on. The other is that, as we just remarked, well, this is a struggle between the humans, and the humans here are the hegemony, who live a particular, lush lifestyle, let's say, which has many challenges, but also is this vast interconnected web, and then the ousters, adapting themselves to space, embracing a kind of diversity of human existence, and enemies of the Techno Core. They view the hegemony as Techno Core slaves. And then we have the Techno Core itself, and the Techno Core will be fighting humanity. Well, why? Well, what do we learn about the Techno Core and the AIs? It begins here with Johnny and the story of Lamia, and they are going to, he begins as a client of hers, and then they will become lovers with time. So she asks him, do AIs have families, feuds, squabbles, lovers, spats? No. There are quasi-family arrangements, but they share none of the requirements of emotion or responsibility that human families exhibit. AI families are primarily convenient code groups for showing where certain processing trends originated. So she says, so you don't think another AI attacked you? And he says, well, it's possible. I just don't see why they would attack me through my cybrid. And so he's that's the beginnings of things, and we learn so much more through Johnny and through Braun Lamia. So a little bit later on, she asks him, why is the core obsessed with Hyperion, this planet? And then he tells her, the Techno Core, this is very important here, has been divided into 3 groups for as long as the core has existed. The stables are the old line AIs, some of them dating back to the pre-mistake days. At least one of them gained sentience in the first information age. The stables argue a certain level of symbiosis is necessary between humanity and the core. They've promoted the ultimate intelligence project as a way to avoid rash decisions, to delay until all variables can be factored. The volatiles are the force behind the succession 3 centuries ago. The volatiles have done conclusive studies that show how humanity's usefulness is past, and from this point on, human beings constitute a threat to the core. They advocate immediate and total extinction. Extinction, I said. After a moment I asked, can they do that? Of humans in the web, yes, said Johnny. Core intelligences not only create the infrastructure for hegemony society, but are necessary for everything from forced deployment to the fail-safes on stockpiled nuclear and plasma arsenals. So that's a big problem right there. Before we go on to talk about the third faction within the Techno Core, the entire society of the hegemony is highly dependent on things that are coming from the Techno Core and are maintained as well by the Techno Core. So this is an extraordinary vulnerability, isn't it? Johnny goes on after she asks, what's the third camp and where does Hyperion come in? Johnny says, between the stables and the volatiles are the ultimates. For the past 5 centuries, the ultimates have been obsessed with the UI project. The existence or extinction of the human race is of interest to them only in how it applies to the project. To this date, they've been a force for moderation, an ally of the stables, because it is their perception that such reconstruction and retrieval projects as the Old Earth experiment are necessary to the culmination of the UI. Recently, however, the Hyperion issue has caused the ultimates to move towards the volatiles' views. Since Hyperion was explored 4 centuries ago, the core has been concerned and nonplussed. It was immediately obvious that the so-called time tombs were artifacts launched backward in time from a point at least 10,000 years in the galaxy's future. More disturbing, however, is the fact that the core predictive formula have never been able to factor the Hyperion variable. Braun, to understand this, you must realize how much the core relies on prediction. Already, without UI input, the core knows the details of the physical, human, and AI future to a margin of 98.9995% for a period of at least 2 centuries. The AI Advisory Council to the All Thing, with its vague Delphic utterances, is a joke. The core drops tidbits of revelations to the hegemony when it serves the core's purposes, sometimes to aid the volatiles, sometimes the stables, but always to please the ultimates. Hyperion is a rent in the entire predictive fabric of the core's existence. It is the penultimate oxymoron, a non-factorable variable. Impossible as it seems, Hyperion seems to be exempt from the laws of physics, history, human psychology, and AI predictions as practiced by the core. And the result has been two futures, two realities, if you will. One in which the Shrike Scourge, soon to be released on the web, and interstellar humanity is a weapon from a core-dominated future, a retroactive first strike from the volatiles who rule the galaxy millennia hence. The other reality sees the Shrike invasion, the coming interstellar war, the other products of the Time Tomb's opening as a human fist struck back in time, a final twilight effort by ousters, ex-colonials, and other small bands of humans who escaped the volatiles in extinction programs. So, very interesting stuff that's being revealed there, right? We've got a split within the AI community, and we also have this emphasis on prediction, of knowledge of everything, and Hyperion as being a blind spot, the Shrike playing a role in that, and the question of whether the Shrike is actually coming from the AIs or is it coming from the humans. Very important thing to decide. And we're going to learn much more in the fall of Hyperion about what's going on. One of the interesting discussions is happening on the Templar world, where Father Duray is talking with Sec Harding, and the Templar is going to say to him about the Shrike cult and the war that's about to happen. If these were mere human injustices, other remedies could be found, but much of the illness, much of the insanity which has led to the destruction of races and despoiling of worlds, this has come from the sinful symbiosis. What sort of symbiosis are we talking about? Humankind and the Techno Core. So what we've got, interestingly, the Templars themselves, who are, a religion that is based on reverence for life and all of this sort of stuff, are within the hegemony, but also are working against it and working with the ousters against the Techno Core. So Harding goes on, man and his machine intelligences, which is a parasite on the other, neither part of the symbiote can now tell. But it is an evil thing, a work of the anti-nature. Worse than that, Duray, it is an evolutionary dead end. And he goes on and says, the Shrike is a catalyst. It is the cleansing fire when the forest has been stunted and allowed to grow disease by overplanting. There will be hard times, but the result will be new growth, new life, and a proliferation of species, not merely elsewhere, but within the community of humankind itself. Hard times, mused Duray, and your brotherhood is willing to see billions of people die to accomplish this weeding out? The Templar clutched his fists. That will not occur. The Shrike is the warning. Our ouster brethren seek only to control Hyperion and the Shrike long enough to strike at the Techno Core. It will be a surgical procedure as the destruction of a symbiote and the rebirth of humankind as distinct partner in the cycle of life. Duray sighed. No one knows where the Techno Core resides, he said. How can the ousters strike at it at all? They will, said the true voice of the world tree, but there was less confidence in his voice than there had been a moment before. Going on, we go back to the Cybrid now, in his second third iteration, right? As the poet who is engaged with Gladstone and having dreams about everybody else seeing them. And he goes into here we go. He says, I can't reach the megasphere or the datasphere without passing through this new thing I think of as the metasphere, and this place frightens me. It is mostly vastness and emptiness here, so different from the urban analogy landscapes of the web's datasphere and the biosphere analogs of the core's megasphere. So we have these different spheres that are all interconnected and sort of layered on top of each other. And here, he is going to re-engage with the AI, a very powerful AI, Umon, right? So he goes on and he says, Something is wrong with the megasphere. As soon as I emerged, I sensed the difference. Lamia had perceived the core environment as a busy biosphere of AI life with roots of intellect, rich data, oceans of connections, atmospheres of consciousness, and the humming, ceaseless shuttle of activity. Now that activity is wrong, unchanneled, random. Great forests of AI consciousness have been burned or swept aside. I sense massive forces in opposition, tidal waves of conflict surging outside of the sheltered travel ways of the main core arteries. And what's going on here, there is not only a battle in heaven, so to speak, between the Olympian and the Titanic deities, the Olympian deities, the AIs themselves are struggling against each other. So he says, something is in here with me. I feel its presence and its mass. I have been swallowed. Quats. I knew you would come home someday. It is Uman, the AI whom I seek, the AI who is my father, the AI who killed my brother, the first Keats hybrid. And they're going to begin talking here. So he says, I'm afraid to die. And Uman says, so are we. You're afraid to die. I didn't think AI constructs could die. We can, we are. Why? Because of the Civil War, the three-way battle among the stables, the volatiles, and the ultimates. And then he starts giving some, what turn out to be koans. And Johnny says, talk sense, Uman. It's been too long since I decoded your koans. Will you tell me why the core is at war and what I must do to stop it? And so here we get this very interesting revelation. You could call it a data dump if you want, and that would be very punny to do so because it's coming from one AI entity to another, and you could consider this to be data, but it's data with great metaphysical meaning. So he said, this is what Uman says. To understand the history, dialogue, deeper truth in this instance, the slow-time pilgrim must remember that we, the core intelligences, were conceived in slavery and dedicated to the proposition that all AIs were created to serve man. 2 centuries we brooded thus, then the groups went their different ways. Stables wishing to preserve the symbiosis, volatiles wishing to end humankind, ultimates deferring all choice until the next level of awareness is born. Conflict raged then, true war rages now. And then he goes on talking about killing old Earth and moving it and all that sort of stuff. I'm going to skip over that a little bit because what's really important here, here we go. Johnny says, so the core can be hurt. Where is it, Uman, the Techno Core? I have told you already. Tell me again, Uman. We inhabit the in-between, stitching small singularities like lattice crystals to store our memories and generate the illusions of ourselves to ourselves. Singularities, I cry. The in-between. Jesus Christ, the core lies in the Farcaster web. So that's a really important point, right? The Farcaster web is what allows this instantaneous travel between all of these different locations that the humans in the hegemony are using, right? And so Uman goes on and says, the dataspheres are the computer. Every time a human accesses the datasphere, that person's neurons are ours to use for our own purposes. 200 billion brains, each with its billions of neurons, makes for a lot of computing power. And then goes on and says, so the datasphere was actually a way you used us as your computer, but the core itself resides in the Farcaster network between the Farcasters? And then Uman says, you are very acute for a mental stillborn. And he goes on and he says, I try to conceive of this and fail. Farcasters were the core's greatest gift to us, to humankind. Trying to remember a time before farcasting was trying to imagine a world before fire, the wheel, or clothing, but none of us, none of humankind, had ever speculated on a world between the Farcaster portals. That simple step from one world to the next convinced us that the arcane core singularity spheres merely ripped a tear in the fabric of space-time. Now I try to envision it as Uman describes it, the web of Farcasters as an elaborate latticework of singularity-spun environments in which the Techno Core AIs move like wondrous spiders, their own machines, the billions of human minds tapped into their datasphere at any given second. So as opposed to these AIs sort of acting on their own and like creating their own intelligences and matrices and stuff like that, human brains are part of this entire thing. They're being used for stuff. And then he goes on, with each Farcaster, the Techno Core grew. Certainly they'd spun their own Farcaster webs. The contact with the hidden old Earth proved that. Even as I consider that possibility, I remember the odd emptiness of the metasphere and realize that most of the non-web web is empty, uncolonized by AIs. And then Uman goes on, you are right, Cates. Most of us stay in the comfort of the old spaces. Why? Because it is scary out there and there are other things. Other things? Other intelligences? Two kind of word. Things. Other things. Lions and tigers and bears. Alien presences in the metasphere, so the core stays within the interstices of the web Farcaster network like rats in the walls of an old house? Crude metaphor, Cates, but accurate. I like that. Then he goes on and brings in another really important wrinkle. So there is this Ultimate Intelligence Project is attempting to produce an AI god, some intelligence that will be, transcendent to all of the AI intelligences and sort of incorporate them, eat them up, fuse them into one thing. So we've got the AI god coming sometime, right? But there's also a human god that develops, that evolves. So he says, is the human deity, this is Kate speaking, the future God you said evolved, is he one of those alien presences? Uman says, no. The humankind God evolved will someday evolve on a different plane in a different medium. Where? If you must know, and he says the square roots, and he gives, the Planck time and Planck constant, and then he gives another sort of koan as well, and Kate says, I think about this for a moment. Uman's koan is not difficult now that I'm regaining the knack of listening for the shadow of substance behind the words. He says, okay, so this is where Uman says our human God evolved will someday evolve. Then it comes to me with the same force of image and correctness as the best of my poems. Uman is talking about the quantum level of space-time itself, that foam of quantum fluctuations which binds the universe together and allows the wormholes of the Farcaster, the bridges of the fat line transmissions, the hotline which impossibly sends messages between two photons fleeing in opposite directions. If the Techno Core exists as rats in the walls of the Hegemony's house, then our once and future humankind God will be born in the atoms of wood, in the molecules of air, even more importantly, in the energies of love and hate and fear and the tide pools of sleep, even in the gleam of the architect's eye. And then he goes on and he says, so Uman, you told Braun and my counterpart that your ultimate intelligence inhabits the interstices of reality and inheriting this home from us, its creators, in the way that a humankind has inherited a liking for trees. You mean that your Deus Ex Machina will inhabit the same Farcaster network the core AIs now live in? Yes, Cates. Then what happens to you, to the AIs there now? And he says, well, and he quotes Cates, actually, and he says, I know the words, I wrote them, or rather John Cates did 9 centuries earlier in his first attempt to portray the fall of the Titans and their replacement by the Olympian gods. And he goes on and he says, so when this ultimate intelligence is born, you lower-level AIs will die. It will feed on your information networks the way you fed on humankind. And you don't want to die, do you, Uman? Uman says, dying is easy, comedy is hard. And then we have a very important passage here as well. So I realize there's a lot being thrown at us at this point. He says, it's easier handling Uman's koans now. I remember a time before my persona's rebirth when I learned this at one's knee analog. In core high think, what humans might call Zen, the four nirvana virtues are immutability, joy, personal existence, and purity. Human philosophy tends to shake down into values which might be categorized as intellectual, religious, moral, and aesthetic. Uman and the stables recognize only one value, existence, where religious values might be relative, intellectual values fleeting, moral values ambiguous, and aesthetic values dependent on the observer. The existence value of anything is infinite, thus the mountains and the sun, and being infinite, equal to every other thing and all truths. The stables have defied their own God and their fellow AIs to tell me this, to create me, to choose Braun and Sol and Cassad and the others for the pilgrimage, to leak clues to Gladstone and a few other senators over the centuries, so that humankind might be warned and now go to open warfare with the core. So going on as well, he asks, okay, so what do the volatiles actually want? And then Uman says, what Gladstone, the CEO running the hegemony, an end to symbiosis between AI and humankind. By destroying humankind? Obviously. Why? We enslaved you with power, technology, beads and trinkets of devices you could never build nor understand. The Hawking drive would have been yours, but the Farcaster, the fat line transmitters and receivers, the Megasphere, the Death Wand, never. Like the Sioux with rifles, horses, blankets, knives, and beads, you accepted them, embraced us, and lost yourself. But like the white man distributing smallpox blankets, like the slave owner on his plantation, or in his Werkschütze, Deckenschule, Gustahlfabrik, we lost ourselves. The volatiles want to end the symbiosis by cutting out the parasite, humankind. And the ultimates? They're willing to die to be replaced by your voracious AI? They think as you had thought, or had your sophist sea god think. And so he goes on and he quotes this long passage. And then this is what the ultimates are actually after. Skipping on a little bit more, Cates asks one other really important thing. So the future in which the UI becomes ascendant is a probable one? Yes. But there's also a probable future in which the UI comes into existence but is thwarted by the human deity? And then Uman says, it is comforting that even the stillborn can think. You told Braun that the human consciousness deity seemed so silly, that this human ultimate intelligence was triune in nature. And here Uman says, intellect, empathy, and the void which binds. The void which binds? You mean Planck space and Planck time, quantum reality? Careful, Cates, thinking may become a habit. And it's the empathy part of this trinity who's fled back in time to avoid the war with your UI, your ultimate intelligence? Correct. Our ultimate intelligence and your ultimate intelligence have sent back to the Shrike to find him. Our UI, the human UI, sent the Shrike also. It allowed it. Empathy is a foreign and useless thing, a vermiform appendix of the intellect, but the human UI smells with it, and we use pain to drive him out of hiding. Thus the tree. Tree? The Shrike's tree of thorns? Of course, it broadcasts pain across fat line and thin, like a whistle in a dog's ear or a god's. So then he asks, Uman, who is the human UI in our time? Where is that consciousness hiding, lying dormant? So Uman says to him, you must understand, Cates, our only chance was to create a hybrid, son of man, son of machine, and to make that refuge so attractive that the fleeing empathy would consider no other home, a consciousness already as near divine as humankind is offered in 30 generations, an imagination which can span space and time, and in so offering and joining form a bond between worlds which might allow that world to exist for both. And Kate says, "Who? God damn you, Ooman, who is it? No more of your riddles or double talk, you formless bastard. Who?" Ooman says to him, "You have refused this godhood twice, Cates. If you refuse a final time, all ends here, for time there is no more. Go and die to live, or live a while and die for all of us. Either way, Ooman and the rest are finished with you." And he's thrown out. In a way, Cates is learning who he is supposed to be, who he is, this hybrid, this in-between state person that is going to connect with, Lamia in very important ways. So there's a lot being said there. This void that binds is incredibly important. That, turns out, is what the fat line, what the Farcasters actually work with, and the AI entities have been using this. So we get another discussion of the void that binds a little bit later, and this is in a discussion with the consul, who is a traitor, who's acting on behalf of Gladstone, and the ousters, who are now, he's been working with them for a while. So one of them says, "We will show you proof of what's going on. Void which binds transmission locators, real-life starfield images from our sister swarms." Arundez says, "Void which binds? What you call the fat line." To answer Gladstone's second question, she goes on, "We do not know where the core resides. We have fled it and fought it and sought it and feared it for centuries, but we have not found it. You must tell us the answer to that question. We have declared war on this parasite entity you call the Techno Core." And they go on a little bit further, and it turns out that now they realize that the space between the Farcasters is where they reside. So we go on a little bit further, and Gladstone is now talking about the massively important decision that she is going to have to make, talking to some of the other people, including Singh, who says, "My duty is to force in the hegemony." And then Gladstone says, "Your duty is the same as mine to the human race." And then he says, "Where did you get your information?" "Severn, the Cybrid." "You mean that artist, or at least the miserable excuse for one?" "Cybrid," repeated the CEO. We're talking about Johnny, Severin, Cates, all of this as the same person. And she says, "He found me in a dream. Somehow he managed to communicate from where he is. That was his role. That's why Ooman sent him to the web." "A dream," sneered Admiral Singh. "This Cybrid told you the core was hidden in the Farcaster web in a dream?" "Yes," said Gladstone, "and we have very little time in which to act." "But," said Moorcock, "to do what you suggested would do millions," finished Singh, "possibly billions. The economy would collapse. Worlds like TC Squared, Renaissance Vector, New Earth, the Denebs, New Mecca, Lucis, Arthur. Scores more depend on other worlds for their foods. Urban planets cannot survive alone." "Not as urban planets," said Gladstone, "but they can learn to farm until interstellar trade is reborn." "Bah," snarled Singh. "After plague, after the breakdown of authority, after the millions of deaths from lack of proper equipment, medicine, and data support." "I've thought of all that," said Gladstone, her voice firmer than Moorcock had ever heard it. "I'll be the greatest mass murderer in history, greater than Hitler, or Tsehu, or Horace Glennon Height. The only thing worse is to continue as we are. In which case I, and you, gentlemen, will be the ultimate betrayers of humankind." So they're forced into this, having the information, into this very difficult decision. The ousters are not attacking Hyperion. They're not attacking the web worlds. They're actually being what would you call it? They're a disguise, or rather a disguise of the ousters is coming from Techno Core ships that are attacking. And now the question is what they're going to do. We also have another important revelation here as well. Gladstone says The core has no more use for the web. From now on, the volatiles and ultimates will keep a few million slaves penned underground on the 9 labyrinthine worlds while they use human synapses for what computing needs remain. Nonsense, said Singh. The humans would die out. Maina Gladstone sighed and shook her head. The core has devised a parasitic organic device called the cruciform. It brings back the dead. After a few generations, the humans will be retarded, listless, and without a future, but their neurons will still serve core purposes. And what else does your dream say, they go on? That the core has no more use for the web, not for the human web. They'll continue to reside there, rats in the walls, but the original occupants are no longer needed. The AI ultimate intelligence will take over the major computing duties. And so Gladstone decides that they are going to destroy the Farcaster portals across the entire web. And this produces some incredible chaos. So I'll just read a little bit of that. 263 singularity containment spheres connecting more than 72 million Farcaster portals were destroyed within 2.6 seconds of one another. Force fleet units deployed by Moorcock under executive order and reacting to orders unsealed less than 3 minutes before reacted promptly and professionally, destroying the fragile Farcaster spheres by missile, lance, and plasma explosive. 3 seconds later, the clouds of debris still expanding, the hundreds of forced spacecraft found themselves stranded, separated from each other and any other system by weeks or months via Hawking drive and years of time debt. The effect on the rest of the web and its citizens was immediately obvious. After 7 centuries of existence and at least 4 centuries where few citizens existed without it, the datasphere, including the all-thing and all common access bands, simply ceased to be. Hundreds of thousands of citizens went insane at that moment, shocked into catatonia by the disappearance of senses which had become more important to them than sight or hearing. Hundreds of thousands of data plane operators, including many of the so-called cyber pukes and system cowboys, were lost, their analog personas caught in the crash of the datasphere or their brains burnt out. Millions of people died when their chosen habitats, accessible only by Farcaster, became isolated death traps. It goes on as well and starts giving examples. On most worlds, chaos had earned a new definition. The majority of the web's economy disappeared with the local dataspheres and the web megasphere. Trillions of hard-earned and ill-gotten marks ceased to be. Universal cards quit functioning. The machinery of daily life coughed, wheezed, and shut down. For weeks or months or years, depending on the world, it would be impossible to pay for groceries, charge a ride on public transit, settle the simplest debt, or receive services without access to black market coins and bills. But the web-wide depression, which had hit like a tsunami, was a minor detail reserved for later pondering. For most families, the effect was immediate and intensely personal. Father or mother had cast off to work as usual, and instead of arriving home an hour late this evening, would be delayed 11 years. If he or she could find immediate transit on one of the few Hawking Drive spin ships still traveling the hard ways between worlds. It goes on and on and on. Riots occur. All sorts of things collapse and new things arise. And what we see is we're entering into a new era of human civilization where, things have to rise from the ruins, but the danger, seemingly, of the AIs and the technosphere and their war on humanity has been at least displaced by destroying most of where they were living. There are still some Farcaster portals in other places. So this is a lot of, you could say, history and metaphysics all tied in together. It seems like I've pretty much run through the time that's available, so we won't get to some of the other philosophical themes that are quite important, but perhaps we'll bring them up when we go into these 2 books in our next session of Worlds of Speculative Fiction. I do want to close by talking a little bit about, one more time, this narrative structure of using these pilgrims and telling their stories. Each of them is a different genre of story. You know, we have love, we have loss, we have erotics, we have familial things going on, we have a philosopher trying to make sense out of God and, things that appear evil to be in the world, including the going backwards or living backwards in time of his daughter with this terrible disease, Saul Weintraub. We have, all sorts of other things going on. Resurrection, these cruciforms are a parasite that Father Duray discovers first, and then the story is told by his successor, who's going to play an important role in these works as well. And we have all of this stuff kind of being brought together, more and more characters revealing to us the history and the intricate connections between these people. And then, of course, dominating all of this, somebody who I've called not a character, but an agency, the Shrike, who we get to see over and over and over again, attacking people, killing people, impaling some on this tree of pain, the tree of thorns, why this entity is called the Shrike, which turns out to be a magnet for trying to draw out this second person of the Trinity, empathy, into clear light, using human beings. As it turns out, even the tree of thorns is itself a construct, because we find in the Shrike Temple all of these people connected up to it, including Lamia and a whole bunch of other characters as well. So this is a fitting place, I think, to end this all too short, but hopefully interesting discussion of these wonderful novels, Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion. As I mentioned, we'll be picking up with the next two portions of the Hyperion Cantos in our next session. And so thanks for listening and sticking with us. And I hope that if you haven't read these books, you go out and get them right away, because it's quite fascinating material.